Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming to this webinar, and I'm excited to present some of our work on our project. So I'm Matt Clark, and I'm the principal investigator of this project, but I have to say that it is a highly collaborative project with a lot of different collaborators in academia, in the nonprofit sector, including Pepperwood, as well as citizen scientists, which we're going to hear about today. These are people that don't necessarily have a PhD, but want to get involved in science. They're also called community scientists, is another way to say that. So we're using citizen science as the kind of official term that's recognized by the federal government, which funds this project. But community science is more inclusive because it could include people that aren't necessarily citizens of the country. I want to acknowledge our funder of this project, which is NASA. And you'll see we're going to be talking about, you might be thinking, why is NASA funding something about birds? But you're going to see that we're going to bring in remote sensing, which is looking at the Earth with satellites or other kinds of sensors, which NASA has a part of their program focused in Earth science and very much interested in biodiversity and other kinds of global change. And so this project was funded by their Citizen Science for Earth Systems program. So it actually required us to include citizen scientists. It's my first foray into this kind of world of working with volunteers, but it's been really enlightening and just really successful, and I'm excited to present this. Okay, so here we go. The motivation for Soundscapes to Landscapes is this looming biodiversity crisis that we're facing. You know, there's species going extinct. Overall abundances of species are declining due to a lot of different factors like habitat degradation, deforestation, and climate change. One recent study just came out and found that bird diversity in North America alone has declined 30%. Not diversity, but abundance. We gotta be clear about that. So the numbers of birds have declined 30% since the 70s. So that's just one aspect of the biodiversity crisis. I brought it up because we're going to be talking a lot about birds throughout this project. But other forms of biodiversity are under stress right now. Getting enough data to understand the kind of biodiversity crisis and what's happening to different organisms is difficult. You know, birds are very charismatic and there's a large birding community out there. Other organisms are less well recognized and understood. But even with birds, it's hard to get data from the field. You have to go out in the field, you got to get access to private property. A lot of the area in the United States, particularly here in Sonoma County, is privately held, so it's hard to get the access. A lot of the data that we have then is just relegated to public lands, places that we can get access. Then there's the limited expertise out there to actually identify different species, particularly with things that are kind of less, things that aren't as charismatic as birds, like maybe fungi and things like that. So ultimately, though, we need these data from the ground to really look at patterns of biodiversity change and track those changes across space and time. And we do that with remote sensing, looking at satellite data or other kinds of images and spatial data from the air. And we link the on the ground field data with those kind of broader scale data that actually measure information through time. And that is just, it's cost prohibitive to get enough data to run these models. So we're looking for new ways to get that on the ground field data. So that's the big motivation. Oh, excuse me, sorry. So our solution here is to try a new form of technology that's becoming a new field in its own. It's called bioacoustics, where you actually place recorders out into the environment, record what we call the soundscape, which includes biotic activity, different animals that are making vocalizations, as well as other sounds like things from humans. And we put out recorders in the field, and then we use acoustic analysis where we treat the sound data as images. And here's an example of what we call a spectrogram, an image of the sound with on the x-axis you see time, and on the y-axis you have frequency of the sound. And what we do is we leverage artificial intelligence that has been developed already for looking at images and identifying objects and images. And we leverage that by including our sound data from different bird species, so the different image vocalizations for each species, that's what you see here on the left, we basically retrain the artificial intelligence algorithm that's been trained on other image data to recognize our bird calls and songs based on their visual pattern in these spectrograms. So that's just kind of coming online in the last few years. We originally weren't going down this road, but we have pivoted and adopted this technology because it's so powerful. And these are the kinds of algorithms you find in self-driving cars and image recognition and applications, and targeting ads and Facebook feeds to you. All that's based on artificial intelligence. So we're piggybacking on all these technological developments. And then ultimately what we do then is link these on the ground data, bird detections, with remote sensing data to make spatial maps that represent different species. So that's what you see on the left here is one of our example maps. This is chestnut-backed chickadee. And it's showing you the probability that the chestnut-backed chickadee occurs across Sonoma County, from low being blue to high being yellow. And so that's one of our goals, is to produce these kinds of maps for each species. So, and these can be folded into conservation kinds of analyses. And we'll get into this later on in the talk. I'll kind of show you some of our preliminary results. I'm just giving you right now a high level overview of where the project's going. And one thing I should mention with the remote sensing is, this is my forte, is we're bringing in a lot of new emerging kinds of remote sensing that NASA's developing. They have an experimental sensor on the space station right now. It's called JEDI. And it's basically a space-based laser, or LiDAR, as we call it, that measures across the landscape, shooting out the lasers. It measures vegetation structure, which is the vertical layering of vegetation, as you can see in this middle figure here. So this is directly related to animal habitat. You could think of, forests with more layering could have more bird diversity. That's been kind of an understanding that's been worked out over the last 60 years in ecology. And so now we're able to measure this kind of vertical stratification through space. So that's being incorporated into our models. And as I mentioned, at the base of all this whole project are citizen scientists, which we couldn't have done this with all the help of the volunteers. So our citizen scientists or community scientists are volunteers from the community, landowners, college students. We've had them involved in field data collection, putting these little low-cost recorders out. We also have them involved in reference data collection, which we need for our artificial intelligence. So to do the artificial intelligence, you need to train the computer. And to do that, you need representative bird calls visualized through these spectrograms. And so we have expert birders, as we call them, people that really know their bird calls, like David, who's on the call. We go through the data, we find representative bird calls, and then we actually have the computer go and do some matches, and we use volunteers to look at those matches. And David's going to explain some more of that work coming up as well. And then ultimately we have these artificial intelligence algorithms that can go through all of our sound data and find bird species as well as other soundscape components. And right now I'm going to hand it over to Rose, who's going to talk about soundscapes in general and what is a soundscape.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. So name of our project, right, is Soundscapes to Landscapes. What exactly is a soundscape? What does it consist of? So here are some kind of broad categories of sound that we could categorize a soundscape into. So a soundscape really contains all of the sounds in a given place or environment. And this can include, animal-made sounds, so insects and birds. It can include also abiotic, kind of natural sounds, so running water or wind. And this is so the bird, insects, that's biophony, and then the next one is geophony. And then it can also include human-made sounds. So any sound made by humans, could be just us talking out in on the land, or could be, you know, cars, airplanes, machinery, that sort of thing. We call that anthrophony. And then there's a fourth category that we've been using in this project that we just call quiet. And this is just where there's an absence of sound detected in a recording at any, you know, given moment in time when we're looking at our recordings. So next slide. So our project is mostly focused on identifying birds in the soundscape. So we have done some work with those broad categories of sound as well, and we'll kind of get a little more into that later. But right now we're just going to take a minute. We're going to listen to this short clip. It's about 30 seconds long, and this is an example soundscape from our recordings. We did choose one that's heavy on birds. So there's a lot of birds in this one since our project has a strong focus on birds. So if there's any birders out there, like take a close listen, see if you can identify any of the species. Feel free to like throw some of the species names into the chat if you recognize them. And then I will also just say before we start it, you may want to turn your audio up just like a couple of notches as we listen to the clip, and I'll give a pause at the end so you can turn it back down before I start talking again. Okay, let's take a listen. All right, hopefully everyone's volume's back down. Yes, I see mourning dove was thrown into the chat. That's true, we heard a mourning dove. So we'll just progress here, Matt, and I'll sort of quickly go through all the birds that were in there, which was a red-shouldered hawk, yep, a Pacific slope flycatcher, Cassin's vireo, mourning dove, as was mentioned. We had a warbling vireo, excuse me, a chestnut-backed chickadee, and a western tanager. So we had 7 species just in that really short clip. So you know, you can see that these soundscapes can be really abundant with lots going on, even just in a short period of time. So there's a lot to learn from these soundscapes. Okay, next slide. So as Matt mentioned, Soundscapes to Landscapes worked really closely with citizen scientists over the course of the project. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the fieldwork component. Fieldwork in particular was largely driven by the efforts of citizen scientists. So we had community volunteers, just folks who were interested in helping out and getting out on the land and putting out audio recorders. We also partnered with landowners, and then also college students completed internships and received academic credit in exchange for, you know, doing a set number of hours helping on the project. To record the soundscapes that we captured, we used this device called the Audio Moth in the second image here. And this is just a low cost, small, easy to deploy audio recorder, just a flick of a switch to turn it off and on. And these we hung in these really simple zipping plastic pencil bags. So the photo on the right with the volunteer smiling, you can kind of see the pencil bag holding the Audio Moth there. Audio moths, we deployed them at each site for about 3 to 4 days. And this was during the breeding bird season. So around like mid to late March, starting in around mid to late March, and then going through until about the end of June, and sometimes a little bit later than that. And then we programmed them to record one of every 10 minutes. So on a 24-hour-a-day cycle, we captured one out of every 10 minutes. Now, about 90% of Sonoma County, which was our study area, is privately owned. So we did use this two-pronged approach to getting a more broad spatial coverage across the county. We wanted to cover as much of the county as possible. So we used 2 techniques to get audio recorders out on the land. One was these, what we called mail deployments. And this was where we actually shipped a package with the audio mods and instructions to a landowner, and then they did the setup on their own property. And I think we have at least one person out there who participated in this method on the webinar today, and then mailed the recorder back after a few days. And then we also had We also did what we called volunteer deployments, and this is where citizen scientists or community scientists went out to both public and private properties to deploy and retrieve the audio logs. So using this two-pronged approach, we found that to be very successful, although the mail deploy did take a little bit more resources just as far as like cost of shipping, and then there's like a slower turnaround on devices because of the mail time. But it was really helpful in filling these geographic gaps across the county and getting, you know, recordings from private properties that we may not have otherwise had access to. So we found that this kind of two-pronged approach was really effective in getting audio recorders across the county. Next slide. So here is just a look at the data that we've collected over the past 5 years across Sonoma County, just sort of raw data. On the map on the right, you can see this is like the density of our recording site locations across the county. And you can see there is this kind of dense cluster at Pepperwood, where we've had kind of this heavy focus and gone back each year. There is an inset map there too, where you can kind of see all the different sites we have across Pepperwood Preserve specifically. And then looking at the graphs on the left, the top graph is the number of 1-minute recordings per year. And then the bottom graph is the number of sites that we visited each year. So just to kind of explain the numbers here, in 2017, we had a prototype phase that we focused in the Mark West watershed. And this was kind of just to show, like, this was our first year to show NASA, our funder, you know, that this could be a successful project and that it was scalable. And then in 2018, we expanded that prototype to Sonoma County. At that point, we were hopeful that the implementation phase would happen and be funded, but we hadn't gotten those funds quite yet. So for those first 2 years, we didn't visit as many of the sites, or capture as much data. And then when the implementation phase, this 3 years of broad scale coverage across the county kicked in, that's kind of when we kicked into full gear, visited a ton of sites, got a lot of hours of recordings. And then our dip in 2020 was, of course, due to the COVID pandemic starting right around the time that our field season was going to start. And so we had kind of lockdown time and delayed start on that field season, although we were able to get out later. And then it just ended up kind of being a shorter survey season that year. So in total, we ended up with over 12,000 hours of recordings from just under 1,300 sites. And this was just a huge accomplishment that could not have happened without the support of our citizen scientists. So thank you. A few of whom I think are on the call today. So thanks so much for your support. So next up, we're going to have David talk, who is a fantastic collaborator, citizen scientist, talking about what we do next with recording data after it is collected from the field. All right, I will pass it to David then. And David, you are muted, I think.
So now we have a wealth of recordings that are stored in the cloud on a web-based platform called Arbimon. Fortunately for us, Arbimon is not just a storage system. It also has a whole variety of tools that we can use to look at, listen to search, and to keep records of our findings on all of the recordings that we made. And it can also provide really valuable information on groups of recordings or on clips that are lifted out of the recording. So really robust tool that way. And our next challenge was to use all of those Arbimon tools to process and understand and learn something from the recordings. Our focus evolved over time. We started simply by tagging recordings, and here's an example of that here. The gray box here to the right side is a visualization of a 1-minute recording. So again, as Matt mentioned, we've got time on the x-axis and frequency on the y-axis, and we started out by listening to these and making notes, boxes around some of the recordings to say, oh, this is a spotted towhee or a dark-eyed junco, and then making also a checklist of the species that we found in these recordings, and sometimes, which was very useful in later analysis, species that are not present as well, so present and not present. One interesting thing about this is that our hearing tends to fade out at like 8 to 10 kilohertz, and these recordings go up to 24. So it was possible to see things that we couldn't hear. which was both interesting and frustrating at the same time. So anyway, that was a neat thing though. The most important task that we did with the recordings was preparing data sets of species for use in training a computer algorithm to detect those species throughout our recording data set, all 12,000 hours of recordings. Although we didn't have all of those at the beginning, we were working with smaller data sets when we started, of course. We settled on something called pattern matching, where we selected an example or a template of a bird sound and then instructed the computer to search all of the recordings to find more clips that were like the template. So next slide, please. So here's an example of what we spent a lot of time working on at this stage of the process. So when we went out looking for clips, we would get back anywhere from not very many to many thousands of examples. And this was part of our task, was to play with different templates to see which ones worked better. And then when we found one that we liked, we would go through these groups of citizen scientists and go through the recordings, these clips here, and if a person thought that the recording, the clip was like the template and was the bird that we were looking for, mark it as present, that's the blue check, and if not, mark it as X, which is not present or absent. And sometimes it wasn't possible to be quite sure about that, and this fifth one in the first row would be an example of that, where it kind of looks like it might be a white-crowned sparrow. This is a white-crowned sparrow set of recordings, but hard to tell just by looking at it. Usually it's really easy to tell when you look at these recordings, or it's often easy at least. So we also, the tool here allowed us to play the clip that we were worried about, and also play the template clip, and be able to sort things out that way. In this case, we decided that it wasn't a white-crowned sparrow. So this whole interface that we developed here was one of the innovations of the project, where we could mark these presences and absences, and citizen scientists could vote, and we used the voting as a way to help sort through some of these more difficult challenges, and also to find all of the easy ones as well. So next slide. And we did a lot of this in the first couple of years in what we called bird blitzes, where we would get we invited anybody who wanted to come to Point Blue headquarters, gave everyone dinner, and then we sat down and spent a couple hours going through these analyses and marking clips, and we're able to move through a whole lot of results very quickly that way, and develop pretty robust data sets from that. And the other thing it brought a whole bunch of people together who didn't know each other, but were interested in birds. Some people who had never really done this kind of thing before, but were curious, and others who have been birding for decades, and we were all able to play a role and contribute. So that was a really cool part of this I think for most of us, if I can speak for the rest of us here. Later on, when COVID hit, one of the advantages of having all of this on a web-based platform was that we could continue working on this remotely. We could work from anywhere really, and that was a very big advantage, because we were able to keep things moving even without being able to have these bird blitzes. Next slide. So the other another use that we made of all of these data, another couple of uses actually. One is called the golden validation, and the second is landowner reports, and we'll come back to the landowner reports a little bit later. but the golden validation was a big effort. Part of what we were trying to do to set this up for the artificial intelligence algorithm work that Leo's going to talk about next, was to identify in the bird blitzes and in that stage of the work at least 500 examples of bird vocalizations that we were interested in. But the other piece of this was the golden validation, where we went through a recording, and again, here's a 1 minute recording, time on the X and frequency on the Y. And what we were doing was going through these recordings and identifying the start and the end of every single vocalization of every bird in this recording. It was incredibly detailed work, and it was pretty exhausting, but it was really key to being able to check the work of the computer algorithms. And let's see, what else was I going to say about this? And we did something similar to that, more simple. And this is kind of a visualization of that for the landowner reports. So so let's play this. This is again a visualization of the bird calls, and this is the same clip that Rose played before. And I'll point out just on the left-hand side here, the red-shouldered hawk is those vertical, the yellow vertical bands here, and the mourning dove that someone called out are these hoo calls down here at the very low frequency, which repeat 4 or 5 times across the bottom of the panel there. And you can listen, see if you can pick out some of the other species. Okay, Matt, if you can play that for us. So one of the things that you can see here is that it only takes a minute to listen to it, but that's a long time compared to being able to look at this and say, okay, I can see a red-shouldered hawk, and it repeats a couple of times here, and the mourning dove is across the bottom. And we learned from working with all of these data that it was way easier and way faster to identify birds by sight through the visualization of these spectrograms than it was by sound. We can always fall back on the sound, and we did a lot as we were learning the process, but we really relied on sight as much as we possibly could. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Leo now. Thank you.
Thanks, David. That was great. So before we go into this detail, I mean, I think you all know, of course, that AI model, artificial intelligence model, is just something that predicts, right? That goes and looks at something and says, I predict this, right? So I want to go over a couple of things here, because what I want to address is this question of, can I trust the results of this model, right? And so a few concepts before going in there is, I may say CNNs, or Matt may mention CNNs. It's just a type of artificial intelligence model. And it's a model that just basically classifies the data into something, right? And CNN stands for convoluted neural network. So there's many types of CNNs. This is just one of them, okay? Now, they produce an output. This output itself is not the classification. It's just that at the end, on top of them, sits a probabilistic model, a classifier model. That's the thing that takes the information. You showed me before all the things, and you call them all a hummingbird. So this one you're giving me now looks like those with certain probability. And so I'm going to call it with certain probability that it's a hummingbird. So the classifier model sits on top of the AI model. Of course, some of these predictions are going to be true. And so we call the true positives. Some of them are not going to be true. they're going to be the false positives. And this is where that golden validation set that David was talking about is so important. So we speak of precision on the prediction, and we say that is a percent of true positives among all the predictions made, right? So as you see in the little equation there, is the true positives divided by the total positives, which is the true positives and false positives, okay? Next slide, please. So let's see what this means. So imagine there's that our model there, convolutional neural network model, and we feed a hummingbird. So the input layer is all these pixels that come from that image. And then there's all these hidden layers and convolutions. There's all the sausage making in this model, right? And then it produces those 3 dots there at the end. That's the output layer. Now the output layer is what the classifier, which is that red bar there, grabs those and says, you know what, 92% that this is a bird or hummingbird, let's say, right? So that's what the classifier. Then the question is, okay, how certain are we that indeed it is a hummingbird, right? That's what we want to know. Well, we're gonna get to that, but so of course we fed these models first 2 types of data. The first one is those types that Rose described: the anthrophony, biophony, geophony, and quiet. And so there's images that we feed, and we train the model with those, right? And then we say, okay, predict on those, okay? Once you know that anthrophony looks like this, and biophony looks like that, and quiet looks like that, then I'm going to feed you something, and you please tell me what it is. And the bottom right is the same concept, except that this time, instead of feeding, anthrophony, biophony, we feed those signatures that David was showing, those labels that David was showing in the spectrogram, which is what the citizen scientists developed, which are the label data, which is, this is a red-shouldered hawk, that is a mourning dove, this is a Cassin's vireo, et cetera, et cetera. And so 500 of those, yes, and also a good amount of them not being the case, right? So this is not a Cassin's vireo, this is not a chestnut-backed chickadee, and so on. And so all that helps train the models, right? And then we get to the predictions. And I want to ask a question again, can we trust those predictions, right? So next slide, please. Turns out in the literature, computer science literature, what people do is, because getting these golden validation sets that Dave was explaining is extremely difficult and time consuming. Mostly what people do is they have all the data to train the model, and they take a holdout set, an out of back set. I'm going to train the model with 90% of the data, I'm going to hold back 10, okay? I know what those are because they were classified by in our case, we're classified by citizen scientists saying this is not a Hudson's vireo, this is not a chestnut-backed chickadee, this is a red-shouldered hawk, et cetera, et cetera. So we know what they are, right? So hold outside, we hold outside, and then once the model is trained and is ready to go to predict, we pass those to the model. Okay, those are those blue bars there. It's what we call the test labels, okay? And you can see that in regarding anthrophony, biophony, geophony, and quiet, the left side of this graph, yeah, they are all very high. In fact, only quiet is less than 90%. And on average, we're like nearly 94%. Anthrophony is high precision, but this is on those holdout sets, okay? Turns out, because how we're training the model, we're finding those sets where you should try to get a nice looking representation of a anthrophony or a bird and whatnot. And so it's usual to expect and to find that the precision is that high, right? Over 90% precision. On the right, you see the same blue bar that represents, again, the precision on the holdout set for birds, and usually 97, 98% throughout is really high. But then comes the golden validations. So in the golden validations it's not a holdout set. It's a set where was not developed using just taking the holdout set from the data we trained. It's just, here's a real life situation. Here's a real life recording. Tell me what you find in there. And David and and all the citizen scientists that worked on this spent a large amount of time and were meticulously recording what they were hearing every second in one of those minutes. And they did nearly 600 minutes of this. So it's a beautiful data set to test the model. And that is the green bars you're seeing there. And you can see that the green bars are usually quite lower than the blue bars. So it's in the 60s and 70s percentiles, right? Some 80 percentiles and so on, depending on the species, which is more real life, which also makes you wonder, okay, wait, 70% precise. There's a lot more false positives in there, right? And so that may be a problem, especially if you're trying to determine if there's biodiversity there. So what we did then, in addition to this, is that we built another model that uses additional information in the recordings. Like, you tell me that this is a hummingbird, or Anna's hummingbird, let's say, or a Cassin's video. How many times did you hear it again singing in that same recording? How many times you hear it 30 minutes before and 30 minutes after in that period, that 1 hour? What other species were singing at the same time where this Cassin's video was singing? So we use that additional information to correct those predictions. Those are the orange bars there. And you can see that they increase the precision significantly throughout in all species, in fact. So next slide. And indeed, this is a proof that this correction helped and brought us to this 80 percentiles and up, in that I would expect that if the correction worked, that we will find fewer species detected in the recordings, and we will find more recordings with 0 species detected, even if that means a false negative. The species was singing, but the model said, no, I'm not going to call it, right? That's okay. That's okay. We can live with that. The bad thing is to say it's a Cassin's video when there was no Cassin's video there. So you can see in the first 2 bars there that the numbers of zeros increased with the correction, right? So that means that now fewer recordings are being called for a species. And you can see that in the other bars, the other pairs of bars, the number 1 species or 2 species or 3 species per recording is actually decreasing after correction. Basically, we're calling fewer species per recording, which is also a good thing. So we are indeed improving the precision of our predictions by reducing these false positives in the predictions. And I think that's all I wanted to say. So hopefully that's kind of clear, and hopefully you can trust this when we say that we're getting high precisions.
I'm going to talk a little bit about what we found at Pepperwood, and this is part of, this is drawn from the kind of information that we are preparing for the landowner reports. So one thing that we drew out of this was the land cover type, and you can see on the left here that there are four main types at Pepperwood: shrublands, which probably are mostly chaparral; herbaceous, which would be grasslands up on the ridgeline and other places; and then a couple of kinds of forests: hardwood forests and conifer forests. As we mentioned, we monitored at Pepperwood for all 5 years of the project. So it's the biggest single property data set that we have. And as you look on the right side and see the number of species detected by time of day at Pepperwood compared to the Sonoma County average, you can see that the lines are quite similar. Partly that's because birds sing in the morning and they drop off as the day goes on, but it's also because the samples that we had from Pepperwood constitute pretty close to 20% of the overall data set that we had. Next slide, please. Here are the top 10 bird species that we saw at Pepperwood. I'll point out one particularly interesting thing to me, and maybe to many of you, is the lazuli bunting that's third from the bottom there. This is a bird that in my experience, birding in the Sonoma Valley where I live, that is pretty unusual. I have a local park here, the Sonoma Valley Regional Park, where I go quite a lot, and I'd never heard of lazuli bunting there through the 2017 season. And then in 2018, which was the first year after the Nuns fire, in our case, came through, there were dozens of lazuli buntings all of a sudden. And so that's evidence that there is a change in the birdscape as a result of fire. And I'm sure that the team that's looking at this, in particular Colin Quinn at Northern Arizona University, who's part of the team, is looking at pre and post fire changes, and we'll find some interesting things like this that I'm looking forward to taking a look at. Next slide. So here's a summary of the variation with time of the soundscape components. So this goes back to Rosa's description of the 4 categories. We can see in the blue line here that not surprisingly, it's quieter at night than it is during the daytime. The yellow line here is biophony, so that includes birds, and you can see that line more or less mimics the previous orange and black lines that we showed a couple of slides back. With a peak in the morning, birds get up earlier and they're more active earlier than we are. It seems like it tails off during the day, but then there's a secondary peak in the evening. And the red line is anthrophony, and you can see that human activity tends to peak around in the middle of the day, with the highest peak right around noontime. Maybe that's everybody laughing while they're eating lunch or something. I don't really know. And then the green line is geophony, and this looks to us like it's showing us that the wind comes up in the afternoon. So we've got a peak that climbs in the late morning and then tops out at 3-4 in the afternoon. So I think with that, I'm turning it back to Matt to talk about future directions.
Great, thanks, David. Okay, so David just presented results from Pepperwood, and I want to mention that right now we're furiously working on what we call landowner reports. So every property that we visited is going to get a PDF that shows them similar figures to what you just saw for Pepperwood for each site, and then at a whole property level. So they'll get the levels of anthrophony, biophony, geophony, as well as different top birds predicted, as well as a complete species list. So we're really excited to get that out as kind of paying back to our landowners all that time they gave to us and the ability to access their property. And so that's a major thing we're working on right now. Beyond that, though, as I mentioned during the Q&A, we're moving it into this next phase of just writing a lot of our scientific discoveries and working with the data and getting a better handle on what signals of bird diversity, as well as these other kind of soundscape components that we find in our data across the whole county. So one of the big kind of products we want to get out early on here, this is part of the original proposal, was to do these species distribution models, which again is a spatial depiction of the probability of each species occurring across the whole county. We already published a paper on this whole kind of process. It was kind of a methodological paper where we input into a series of machine learning models, spatial predictor variables, which you see here on the left. We had data from that laser sensor I was talking about that represents canopy structure, phenology, which is the greening up and browning down of vegetation, which we can get from satellites. Climate variables that have been modeled that gives you things like temperature and precipitation, as well as some auxiliary variables like distance from roads and distance from streams and distance from the coast. All those were in a spatial format that could be brought into this machine learning process. There's actually 7 of these different algorithms. It doesn't matter what they are. They all predict differently, and then they all kind of vote on the final map. But from these, we can tell for each bird species, what are the important predictor variables, which was really insightful. For example, in this paper, we found that the species that tend to be in conifer forests, like the Northwest coast forests, tend to be more predicted by the structure variables. So things from the LiDAR, the laser sensor, which makes sense. These are forests with a lot of structural complexity. So we're looking to now redo this analysis using so let me back up say that this previous paper was done with existing data from Point Blue, and eBird, which is another citizen science project. A lot of just kind of publicly accessible sites rather than private properties. We're now going to fold in all of our sites into a new analysis and incorporate some new remote sensing data. The canopy structure in particular, before in this paper, we simulated it, simulated the space-based LiDAR using airborne data because the actual sensor on the space station hadn't been launched yet. Now it is on the space station and it's been acquiring data the last couple of years. So we're excited to use those data and kind of redo this whole analysis. Okay, and we're also going to work on our 54 bird species. Here's an example from this paper of just what these species distribution models look like for each bird species. You can see we get, probability of occurrence, but we also give you an error map, as Leah was saying. You got to be skeptical of every model, that there is error in the process. It's never 100% perfect. And so we like to be honest about the error. And you can see, some birds do well, and that's kind of on the purple side. Towards kind of orange side means we're more uncertain. So California quails, for example, are not so great relative to Brewer's blackbird, which we did rather well in our predictions across the landscape. So again, this is using existing data. Now we're going to be incorporating in the acoustics-based stuff from the artificial intelligence. We're also, I'm going to be showing you just kind of real hot off the press stuff. There's this meeting happening right now called the American Geophysical Union Conference. Big, giant, like the world's largest conference on planetary science and earth science. And so we have two of our collaborators in our group are presenting at this conference. So we have some new analysis, like hot off the press for that conference. That's typically what we do as scientists is we have a deadline to meet. And in this case, it's a conference. So we get some initial results out and then we work on the paper. So this is by Colin Quinn, who's a graduate student at Northern Arizona University doing his PhD. And his talk shows this slide, which is something we can do with our data, is actually model overall richness of birds. So this is bird richness in a spatial way. And you can see, the North Coast forests over here are not so rich in bird species, but you have to remember this is just 43 of all the bird species in the county, and it's not even all of our 54 bird species right now. So that's going to get worked on, and we'll at least be using all of our bird species. But always just look at this figure and say, okay, well, it's not. You see, there's low bird richness down here near the bay. But we're not including shorebirds, for example, in our analysis. So we are not capturing all the birds, but it is interesting to look at that, the kind of redwoods, Doug fir forests on the North Coast are not as rich, but there's a lot of richness down here kind of in Sebastopol area, and also where Pepperwood is. Colin's also, again, hot off the press for his conference talk, has produced these maps of anthrophony, biophony, and geophony even. I'm just showing you these two because they're really interesting. You can see anthrophony, human level noise is really concentrated along the 101 corridor and also Highway 12 and, where the urban areas are, makes sense. And even along like Russian River, kind of the road going out to the coast. Biophony, now this includes birds, but also insects and amphibians all together, is kind of similar to I'll go back. You can see, there was that bit down here in Santa Rosa looking at bird richness that relates to our biophony map, but also there's a lot of biotic noise down here near the bay and out here around Highway 12 and even up into Pepperwood. So it's a slightly different map. It's not just birds, but when you look at amphibians and insects and other animals, this soundscape of biophony is different, but still rather quiet up here in the North Coast. Okay, so that brings us to another initiative we're working on again for this AGU conference. And this is something that we're really trying to see if we can push this. It's really kind of out there right now. It's really exploratory. Nothing else has been done like this really yet. But so we found that doing this artificial intelligence classification exercise that David and Leo got into, it took us like 2 years to do that. It wasn't even something originally we were going to do, but artificial intelligence became more accessible to us computationally with graphics cards and all like new code available to us. So we got into it, but it's taken a long time to get where we are. And so we think we need another approach. If we're going to really scale this across other regions, you know, globally, or even just at a state level, it's just a really expensive endeavor to get into this artificial intelligence. You need that reference data to really train it. You need the expertise to do this. So we have a new idea, which is to see if there's a relationship just between acoustic diversity and biotic diversity, and kind of look at the acoustic diversity as kind of a measure of integrative biodiversity without having to get into the deep learning artificial intelligence stuff. And then there's all these new advances with remote sensing. I've been talking about LiDAR, so that measures vegetation structure with lasers, so the habitat, like physical complexity. And then there's also hyperspectral remote sensing, which is a new technology that NASA is hot on putting onto a satellite, and they have actually money dedicated to this right now. But we have airborne data. It's not on a satellite for us to use yet, but we have this airborne data. And what hyperspectral data does is it provides light that's reflected from the surface, and it responds to the absorption properties of the surface materials. So it could be building rooftops or vegetation, but if it's vegetation, it responds to like the chemical composition of the vegetation, things like water content, chlorophyll, nitrogen levels, all can be detected with this technology, which could be related to habitat. So we're looking for ways to maybe link acoustic richness, airborne LiDAR structural richness, and this airborne hyperspectral richness together in a unified way. There's some computation behind that. I'm just going to skip over that, but let's just say you have this metric of richness, like how diverse it is. If you look at this figure on the left, imagine you have a forest that has a lot of vertical complexity to it, you know, like tall trees and small shrubs, versus this plot 2, which is just more kind of low level vegetation. So we would say that plot 1 has more vertical richness to it, so more structural richness. In terms of its spectral properties, plot 1 has more species of trees, and maybe some of them are fruiting or flowering in a different way than plot 2, which maybe has fewer species. And so this one, plot 1, would have more spectral richness to it, where plot 2 maybe less so. And then if there's a lot of structural kind of habitat niches, you know, from the species diversity of plants plus the structural complexity of the plants, that might lend itself to more niches for animals. So you might get more biotic richness, which would theoretically translate into more acoustic richness, more birds making calls, more amphibians, insects, etc., making calls that we could detect. So that's kind of the idea, of seeing, okay, can we look at this richness levels between the habitat variables measured by the remote sensing and the acoustic that we're getting from our sound recorders. Okay, so the question first is there a relationship between bird richness and acoustic richness? And well, we did a little, this is again something we just did last week, but I'm presenting it here. There is a relationship. This is across the whole county. There's this linear relationship. And we call it, you know, remote sensing scientists looked at this and say, oh, it's not that strong. There's a lot of scatter. But from an ecologist standpoint, this is actually a pretty interesting relationship. So this is acoustic richness versus bird taxonomic richness coming out of our artificial intelligence stuff. So predicted bird richness. Okay, so yes, there is something there. There is something related to at least bird richness and acoustic richness. However, it is complicated. This is showing you over here that when we actually like trying to unpack how anthrophony, biophony, and geophony are related to acoustic richness, this is acoustic richness on the Y, and this is levels of anthrophony, biophony, geophony, and quiet. You can see that anthrophony actually does relate pretty well with this acoustic richness variable. So it is a driver of the variation in that measure. That's the primary driver, actually. So human noise is a primary driver of this acoustic richness. And then biophony is the next most important kind of predictor of acoustic richness. And then next comes geophony. Geophony may look like it's stronger, but it actually has so much variation that it turns out statistically biophony is the second most important predictor of acoustic richness. Okay, so there's something there to acoustic richness that could be used as a way to monitor biodiversity, but it's complicated. And we really need to go, that's the kind of the next phase of this research, is to really figure out ways to maybe account for anthrophony and geophony, kind of the noise component, and pull out the signal component for us, which is biophony. However, we are making some inroads into seeing how this looks spatially across the county. And this is with collaborators at Jet Propulsion Lab, NASA's facility down in Pasadena, that have been previously worked on looking at this kind of richness idea with LiDAR and hyperspectral data, but haven't looked at the acoustic richness before. So it's a great collaborative team to kind of come together and unite our different approaches. But you can see in terms of acoustic richness that, there's parts of the North Coast here where the redwood kind of dug for forest. It's not so rich, but it really picks up in these areas that are urban or outdoor Sebastopol or even eastern kind of mountain ranges. Structural richness can be quite kind of high. One thing I was supposed to point out is that I just want to make sure we're aware here that the low richness in these figures is purple, and higher richness, or whatever variable it is kind of yellow. All right, so acoustic richness is lower, like along here, really, really quite low down here, and then out here towards the coast, and then it picks up over here towards the east, and especially in urban areas, as that's the anthrophony. And then the structural richness can be kind of high depending where you are in these forests, but then also low, particularly low in kind of wetland laguna areas, and then out in these pastures out kind of in the south of the county. And then spectral richness is kind of interesting because you get a lot of richness just from urban areas and agriculture and just kind of natural areas kind of interspersed with each other in the lowland areas, and then also towards the east where you've got oak woodlands that it's exposing trees and gaps and dead grass with trees, so that creates a lot of spectral richness. But then it maybe is not so rich, in a continuous canopy redwood forest, for example. So when we try and look at acoustic richness versus some of these remote sensing variables, we find some kind of just at the whole county level, there is a relationship between acoustic richness and spectral richness, which you see in the top right. But it's an interesting relationship when you look at structural richness, because the structural richness is actually quite low in some of these lowland areas here, because there's not a lot of forest vegetation, right? This is ag and urban areas and pastures. So structural richness is low, but the acoustic richness is high. So we get this kind of inverse relationship. So what we're finding is you really have to look within different land cover types to really understand what's going on. And that's where we're moving now, is looking at land cover and seeing the patterns. But this is just showing you conifer, that the relationship strengthens as a structural acoustic relationship, which is what we would really expect with forest. That as you get more structural richness, you get more biotic richness, which translates into acoustic richness. And here the anthrophony is not complicating things as much in the conifer forest, because the anthrophony was, was quite low in these forests. So it's really just more the biotic signal. Okay, so that's where we're headed. Some kind of new innovative research. And at the last slide, I just want to mention that here we have our webpage, and we have Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. We had a lot of activity on social media during the life of the project. We're quieting down now. We're entering a phase, like I said, we're just working on research. So going forward, our social media will present our findings, when we publish a paper or present at a conference. So that's what you'll find on our webpage. As I mentioned, we are going to have a limited field campaign in 2022 in the breeding bird season. So if you're interested in maybe hosting a recorder, you can go to our webpage and sign up as a volunteer. And then if we feel like we have the capacity to include you and put a recorder on your property, we'll reach out to you. But like I said, we're going to be mainly focusing in on areas that we've already been, particularly areas that have burned, and that we can then use those data for a kind of post-fire analysis of change. Okay, well, thank you for your attention.